Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and to all my colleagues here online who will be taking part in this Bendi webinar. This webinar is supported by PCIW, and we want to welcome all the audience to this Bendi webinar. PCIW is supporting our trusted member and on education and how data intelligence software can protect professional clothing and its companies, and also the challenges that will face in the labor and the right to exploration by helping and give visible to their supply chain and identify and analyze risk. So just a little bit about who I am. My name is Yvette Ashby, and I'm the CEO and founder of Professional Clothing. Professional Clothing Association is dedicated entirely to the entire supply chain and we advocate for sustainability and and education. It is important, this webinar, I took this on because I really believe that it is important that everybody has got the rights and the rights to have much information as possible. Professional clothing is one of those areas that seem to be overlooked. And we saw a lot of that during the pandemic, where the government didn't have a clue where to go for information. I sat on that board with the UKFT, giving all the information to our government, and only to find out they did not understand. This is why I believe in what Bendi is doing today, is to be giving information, understanding the challenges that professional clothing industry is facing, and have intelligent data to impart to everyone, so everyone can sort of learn from it and have a focus and a source where they can go to make it easier to work. So our panel today, we have 3 amazing speakers. The first one is coming up will be Jennifer Jabber, Director of Social Compliance and Safeguarding at BRAC. We also have Catherine Sturbley, and I hope I pronounced that right, Catherine. Catherine is the Vice President of Corporate Governance and Social Responsibility of Ansell. And of course, our host is Mandeep Soar, Chief Executive Officer of Bendi. And my colleague here, Declan Osborne, is the editor, and he will be putting together some questions for you later on. They should run about an hour. So anyone who has any questions, please put them at the end, and Declan will direct you and guide you through it. So without further ado, let me start off with our first speaker this afternoon, Jennifer Jabber from BRAC.
Thank you, Red. So my name's Jennifer Jabbar. I'm the Director for Safeguarding and Social Compliance at BRAC. BRAC is the largest NGO in the world, and at the center of what we do, women are there. We work in the clothing sector, in the RMG sector, whereby we work on system strengthening, and we do this for ensuring rights at work and ensuring a conducive environment. We take a holistic approach to the rights at work. So as I myself have worked over 25 years in this sector, in the RMG sector, where I've worked with various brands, European, UK, and US. And I have also worked with the association, Employers Association, and now I'm working at BRAC. So sort of seen this industry and the compliance of this industry for over 25 years. So as we go into the topic right now, we've seen the Modern Slavery Act of the UK. It's an important legislation, but right now, if we talk of it, it has a negative framework where we talk of the extreme forms: servitude, forced labor, human trafficking, slavery. As we move from more aspirational and forward thinking, we come into the decent work aspects, where employment opportunities, we broaden the horizon to think of adequate pay, decent hours, safety, security, gender issues, equal opportunity. So, but both for modern slavery and decent work, the measuring tools, very compliance driven, but the measuring tools and incremental progress, you could say, may have had certain lacks in there. And now the thinking is much more wider on rights at work. So upcoming legislations are coming in where human rights due diligence, corporate sustainability, corporate sustainable due diligence is being talked about. And I think it's quite good in the sense that now we can look at things in a holistic way. Addressing rights at work needs to be quite holistic, not confined to the extreme forms, but basically a conducive work environment. And how would we ensure that conducive work environment? It comes from the leadership and the ownership on the top. And I think now is a time that we're showing a holistic approach. We can show that it's not actually a barrier to productivity, but actually it leverages and supports in increasing productivity, because a person who feels respected in the workplace will be more productive than anywhere else. So I think the holistic approach, it's a risk management and also a complaints redressal mechanism, what human rights due diligence brings in, what it's based on, and many supply chain legislations are already out. So France, Netherlands, Germany, Norway, and the EU in 2021 adopted that there would be due diligence legislation, which next year we are expecting it is to come out, either as human rights due diligence or corporate sustainability due diligence. It builds on the UN guiding principles of business for human rights. It's basically based on the basic Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles of Rights at Work. So we talk about basically rights in the workplace and how we can ensure a conducive work environment. So issues like low wages, excessive OT, pollution factors, discrimination, forced labor. So all of these aspects are, we need to do a risk assessment, and that's what human rights due diligence is talking about. The rights at work try to identify with a human-centered design that the people risks in the supply chain. So what are those risk factors? And then as we do the risk assessment, what are the mitigation measures we can put in place? When we talk of supply chain, everything does not fit into one box. There will be companies, organizations who are more ahead of the curve. So the primary suppliers to the brands, the R&D factories, many of them are at quite an advanced level. As you go more down the supply chain, then much more awareness has to be brought about, because over the last 30, 35 years, we focused through audits on the primary suppliers. So when you go throughout the supply chain, we must be able to contextualize and understand that everything will not fit. And through risk assessment, we see what the risk factors are, we prioritize, and we bring in short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures in place. And that is what the human rights due diligence is basically saying. Corporations will be given time to build in the processes within the supply chain and incremental progress. So measuring tools to basically risk assess, risk mitigate, and then people must be able to bring about complaints. So the reporting mechanism needs to be transparent, and complaints need to be addressed of any sort of violations. Learnings go into support in strengthening the systems on the policies and procedures which are owned by the top management. And like that, you can address the supply chain through a management process. So these are some of the things that are coming in the future, from a tell mode of brands basically saying you're not complying with XYZ, to a factory owning their own management process and basically looking at it holistically as to the why we're doing it, and demonstrating to them what to be done and how to be done through these legislations, will let them own their own management process and bring a holistic approach to addressing what rights at work. And a conducive work environment, I think, is the end goal that we all want to see. So I think the audit fatigue which we've had over the years can now be transformed into looking at the rights at work and how businesses are actually practicing through a management process. And it's not only, it's also a state has certain responsibilities, the private sector have responsibilities, but it's not only just the manufacturer. The brands and the consumers equally have a role to play if you want to ensure rights at work globally, because the brands also need to understand that if rights violations are basically manufacturers are bringing them up, that means it's a good thing. That means reporting is happening, it is being addressed, rather than doing hit and runs when such issues come in. So it's a responsibility.
Can I just step in there for a moment? Yeah. I sit on the board with the ECHO. A matter of fact, we had this yesterday. This is the employers' consultation for the Home Office. So I sit on that board to support this very subject and companies. But I thought it was a bit harsh when they said if you break the compliance, you could be found with £40,000, or worse still, your business can be shut down like that overnight. Why is it so harsh? I found that was really quite shocking. I know, are they saying that they would have had plenty of notice on this, or would this just have been, do they have time to sort of sort it out before it gets to that level? Because I'm sure everybody wants everyone to work. So that's something that struck me yesterday, that wow, that is so harsh. What do you say?
I think I agree with you, because suddenly when you're looking at things holistically and you're going to change behavior, everything we're talking about rights at work will be where people, gender has for centuries, the gender and the power and all of the intersectionality, all of this, you're suddenly wanting to say rights means this. So to change that will take a long time. What can happen is that systems and processes can be built, but actually to bring about that change in behavior takes time. So now, if you say that upfront you're going to charge, say directors will be fined so much money if the due diligence is not improving, that also will not be a solution. That time has to be given, that yes, show us incremental progresses that are happening, and the fines should actually come in later. If you really want to make things work, it's building consumer sense. It's building brand sense that reporting is also a good thing. Brands do the hit and run because what will consumers say? Everybody has to understand that rights are important for a conducive work environment, but to embed all of this will take time, systems to be created. And these fines, I think, upfront to charge fines right now is harsh, because this will take time. We can say that be accountable for ensuring, say, XYZ within, say, 2 years. And then also, if you talk about supply chain, like I said, supply chain primary manufacturers have had all the compliance, ensure X, Y, Z, and people have done, not the entire supply chain. So if your expectation cannot be, the expectation cannot be that high that we also want the supply chain down to adhere to, say, modifying standards at the same pace. So recognizing that if people feel that it is something they can do, it will be done. If people feel the problem is too big and they cannot do it, then we've lost the battle already. We cannot bring that change. And by doing small progress, I think everybody will own that the fact that it actually helps in productivity increase. So your productivity, it's a return on investment. It's an investment which will be giving, because when people are happy, they will be more productive. And if they're not happy, then it's not a barrier.
Do you see what the beautiful innovation that Mandeep is bringing to the table? Because I would like to think that what she's proposing now, we can go and I can take this to my group and say, do you think this is? Do you see that as a vehicle that would help?
I think we're going to go through a test and trial stage. So we have to test out certain solutions on how things can work. So the data and all of that. So I cannot say immediately what would happen, because this industry changes every 6 months.
It is. I know. I've been sitting on
It's
this.
an ever-changing industry.
Yeah.
So it's like tracking this industry. I've worked for brands, so their strategies change very frequently, and it's all driven by consumers and consumer demands. So what would work has to be trialed and tested.
I've broken my own rules by asking questions, but I just thought it was so important. Okay, thank you. Are we finished here, Jennifer? Shall I move on?
Yes, I think, yes.
Thank you. We'll come back with questions later.
Sure.
Catherine, we welcome Catherine now. She's the Vice President of Corporate Governance and Social Responsibility of Ansell. Welcome, Catherine.
Thanks, Yvette. It's a great pleasure to be here today to talk to you all about labour rights and modern slavery and how we can all work towards eradicating labour exploitation. As Yvette said, my name is Catherine Stribley. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Governance and Social Responsibility at Ansell, which is essentially focusing on our social or people strategy and initiatives. So just a little bit about Ansell. Ansell is a diversified global leader in hand and body protection solutions. We design, manufacture and market products which millions of workers and healthcare workers rely on around the world. We have 15 manufacturing operations, including in Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, China and Vietnam, and also work with a very large global third-party supply chain. So we're in the business of protecting people, but our focus is not just about the protection our products provide our customers, but also ensuring the rights of our workers and the workers in our supply chain are protected. So we're committed to protecting human rights of all workers who interact with Ansell. Ansell operates in an industry and across a number of countries that are considered high risk for labour exploitation. So consistent and effective management of labour rights is critical. Our approach to labour rights is twofold. We look to identify, address and remediate instances of modern slavery and broader adverse labour rights impacts, but also look to introduce initiatives that improve the lives of workers, so similar to what Jennifer was talking around decent work. So first, it's important to understand the risks. A few years ago, we engaged an independent third party to conduct a risk assessment over our internal operations and our third-party supply chain. This risk assessment identified modern slavery risks and then determined a risk rating for each of both Ansell operation sites and Ansell suppliers. This then allows us to focus on the high-risk areas as it's not possible to cover every risk and every supplier and every location all at once. So for us, our immediate attention went to focusing on our finished goods suppliers first. So since this initial risk assessment, our operating context has continued to change. Through our program, we develop and refine the risk profiles across the operations and the supply chain. And as the operating context changes and evolves, so do the labour right risks. And I think, again, Jennifer was referring to it, it's constantly evolving. So we've got to make sure our labour rights controls are agile and continuously reviewed to mitigate any challenges of this sort of evolving risk landscape. So next, it's important to, it's important to develop policies, frameworks, and controls and have a clear set of expectations. So we used our risk assessment to introduce a set of robust controls to mitigate risks and to minimise the likelihood of their reoccurrence. We set clear expectations regarding labour standards and human rights, both across our operations and our third-party supply chain. And we do this through a series of policies, frameworks, and controls. At our own operations, again, we take a risk-based approach to upholding labour rights, focusing the greatest effort on the people at greatest risk. And namely for us, that's production workers at our Asia-based plants. We developed a labour standards management framework, and that standardises our approach to labour rights and labour standards across our manufacturing sites. So we apply a consistent approach to labour standards globally. We've also implemented a what we call a labour rights operational strategy. And so under this is 6 pillars, and this really underpins our strategy. And the categories which we focus on each of them are stakeholder management and industry participation, grievance monitoring, worker engagement, risk assessment and monitoring, accountability and awareness, and of course the policies and the commitments that sit underneath it and support that strategy. So this strategy helps identify areas for improvement and appropriate responses, and then also leads us to continuously achieve best practices. In regards to our supply chain, we seek to work with suppliers that align to our commitment to respect and uphold human rights, and we set clear expectations through our supplier code of conduct. We've also established a supplier management framework, or we call it the SMF, and this is meant to drive meaningful change in our supply chain. Again, it takes, similar to what we did at our own plants, the SMF takes a risk-based approach to due diligence, and it assigns appropriate processes to target areas of the highest risk. So the framework has been rolled out in 3 waves, with suppliers categorised according to the level of modern slavery risk. Also relevant factors are the spend we have with these suppliers and also the criticality to our business. So through the implementation of the SMF, it enables us to continue to expand our due diligence program over time, increasing the scope of existing activities to cover more and more of our supplier population. So we've gone from wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, essentially, and that just covers more of our supplier base. This supplier management framework also includes a risk profiling and escalation framework. So the risk profiling and rating system assigns clear categorization that dictates the type of due diligence we're required on this group of suppliers. And that complements the monitoring and the engagement activities that we do. So the rating system, and it goes from sort of A to D, considers the quality of the suppliers' labour standard management systems and also their grievance mechanisms. We also consider their willingness to engage with us on labour rights. Second party and third party audit results are always a relevant factor in our assessment of a supplier's risk, but also their responsiveness to identify and address and remediate any audit findings and implement any corrective actions. We also look at external input or findings on the supplier and any regulatory sanctions. So some of you may be familiar with the US Customs and Border Protection withhold release orders. I mean, that has played a really significant role, particularly in the Malaysian glove industry at the moment, because it really does stop suppliers in their tracks. So we also consider whether any of that is applicable to the suppliers that we're working with or we're looking to work with. So these inputs inform our supplier categorization, and then the type of engagement and the monitoring that's required, and then any relevant escalation process to follow if anything's not going to plan. So Ansell's committed to improving labour practices with our suppliers through meaningful action. But importantly, we don't automatically cancel or terminate supply contracts upon allegations of adverse labour rights or modern slavery. Instead, we engage with the supplier, because if we keep walking away, it's not going to solve the problem. They'll just work with someone else that's not so focused on this, and the workers will still be subject to the same conditions. So for us, it's really important that if we see that there's risks, we actually engage with the supplier. And so we'll engage with them, we'll monitor their labour rights by supporting the development and implementation of corrective actions. It's probably where suppliers are unwilling to either engage, unwilling to undertake corrective actions. That's when we sort of start to consider whether these are the right partners for us. But it is that sort of the last resort. We really do try and engage with these suppliers to get them on board with, better labour standards for the industry. For us personally, we've helped 3 of our suppliers progress from what was a D rating, which is almost we're not going to work with you anymore, to C rating and above. And we've done this through a series of proactive and frequent engagement activities. So top-to-top engagement, that's where senior management at Ansell and senior management at the supplier engage and have conversations and work together. Performance monitoring of the supplier's corrective actions, and also sharing our best practices. I mean, we have learned a lot on this journey as well. And so it's important that we can share what we've learned and the best practices we see working. And there's other monitoring tools as well, such as, looking at working hour tracking sheets. Also audits done by Ansell on the diligence activities also apply to prospective suppliers. So this includes communicating of Ansell standards via supplier code of conduct, completing self-assessment questionnaires, and also third-party audits. So any prospective suppliers need to satisfy our screening requirements and show a commitment to and compliance with our labour standards before working with us. So now if we look at the monitoring and engagement programs we're using, because a monitoring program is key to manage adverse labour rights impacts and identify improvements and opportunities to improve in our operations and also our third-party supply chain. As our program has matured, we have definitely strengthened our approach through an increase in the type of audits and also the number of audits, increasing the touch points with vulnerable workers, and I'll talk a little bit more about worker voice and grievance in a minute. And also conducting training with our procurement teams and third-party supply chain. So I think monitoring is important, but also that engagement is essential to really an effective labour rights strategy. As I mentioned, so monitoring activities include internal audits at our own plants done by our own people and third-party audits. Engagement activities can include training, worker engagement, supplier briefing. I talked a little bit about top-to-top engagement. We've also recently held a global supplier summit for the first time this year, and that was just another way to engage with our suppliers. For our own plants, we engage certified external auditors to conduct SMETA audits. And where there's a higher risk of forced labour, we also use what's called forced labour indicator assessments. These are newer audit mechanisms. Forced labour indicator assessments, they differ from other audits in that the burden of proof is on the auditee to evidence that the indicators are not present. So forced labour indicator assessments generally use a red, green, yellow system to assess the presence of forced labour risks. And the presence of one or more red flags indicates increased risk. And so that then requires further investigation and potentially action to assess the presence of forced labour and mitigate against it. Importantly, we've seen an increase in requests for these forced labour indicator assessments, particularly from our European and US customers. In addition to third-party audits, we also use our internal global, what we call HR CSR teams, to perform internal assessments of our own operations. There's several benefits of this. It's increased our engagement between senior and executive level management, plant managers and employees. We've also seen an increased collaboration and dialogue on how we address the risks. It also helps us get ready for external audits, and just generally provides us a greater visibility on our progress at our operational sites. We also require our suppliers to undergo third-party audits on an ongoing basis, and the frequency of those audits is determined by their risk level. And so these third-party audits assess the compliance with Ansell supplier code of conduct, our labour standards, local laws and other applicable standards. We require our suppliers to be audited against either the SMETA framework, which is what we use. We also reference BSCI or SA 8000 or other equivalent audits by accredited third parties. And suppliers may also have additional findings from other third-party or customer audits, such as the forced labour indicator assessments, which also add some further information on the supplier's practices and on-the-ground conditions. And these audits are used to continually build our awareness of potential risks and also identify potential improvements. Another important element is grievance mechanisms and actions to strengthen the worker voice. And I think this is where, audits are such an important element of our strategy, but it's not the only one. And I think we need to understand and have that real-time interaction with what's happening on the ground. And that's where we think that worker voice is really important. So, we acknowledge the importance of effective grievance mechanisms and its role in our modern slavery risk management process. We provide all workers in our internal operations with access to grievance mechanisms. We recognise the importance that workers feel safe to raise any complaints or issues. And as a result, our staff have access to a range of grievance mechanisms, including secure and anonymous options, so that if they don't feel safe or comfortable telling their manager, they can do it to a hotline that is managed by a third party and it's confidential. We also have a no retaliation policy to ensure that staff to reassure the staff that there's no adverse consequences for reporting concerns. We reach out to our workers through several informal and formal mechanisms. We've had positive results from worker engagement programs and found these sessions just helped open that two-way dialogue between Ansell employees at the executive manager level and also that production level employees as well. Worker engagement and that third-party grievance mechanism channel, they're really two primary avenues through which we're aiming to strengthen that worker voice, and it's a really big ongoing goal for us. But looking beyond compliance, it's important to drive initiatives that really improve the lives of workers generally. And again, Jennifer sort of touched on this a bit in her earlier presentation. But it's important not to just focus on modern slavery risks, but also to make an impact on the well-being of workers. And so we do this through initiatives that provide safe and decent work. Two initiatives that we're currently working on are living wage and 60-hour work week. The living wage initiative is to enable workers to earn enough income to fulfill basic needs such as food, housing, transport, healthcare, education. And it's sufficient to support the worker and their family within standing working hours, so they're not working excessive overtime. In addition, the 60-hour work week initiative comes from the recognition that in many of the countries we're operating in, local laws permit workers to work up to 80 hours a week. And so that can result in sort of a 12-hour day on average, which is, it's it can be harmful for workers and their well-being. So moving our ambition forward, this year we did make a commitment to implement a maximum 60-hour work week across our sites for all our production workers. And so over the next few years, we're going to make sure that we implement that change. So why is this important? Aside from the ethical and moral considerations to ensuring high standards when it comes to modern slavery and labour rights in your supply chain, there are business reasons to ensure that you understand your risks and you mitigate against them. Again, Jennifer mentioned that the modern slavery regulations around the world continue to increase exponentially. Reporting requirements, governments are cracking down on modern slavery, and I gave you a good example of the US Customs and Border Protection withhold release orders, which basically stop products coming into the US where they suspect forced labour. But also investors, and we're a publicly listed company in Australia. So investors are sort of an important stakeholder for us, but investors and customer expectations in regards to labour standards are also increasing. And also modern slavery claims can turn into significant reputational risks for companies. So there's a whole lot of business reasons, as well as the kind of it's the right thing to do, as why people really need to pay attention and progress their labour standards and modern slavery programs. But importantly, this is not a one-man race. I don't think sustainability is a competitive advantage. I think it should be something that we all collaborate and do together. And this is on social side of things and the environment. But in this space here, I mean, collaboration is key. The modern slavery challenges cannot be solved by a single company in isolation. It's important that collaboration is part of any labour rights strategy, collaboration with other industry participants, and that will include your competitors in some cases, regulators, customers, and NGOs. A small example of how we're trying to collaborate is the Responsible Glove Alliance, which is known as the RGA. In March last year, the RGA was launched with 7 founding members, including Ansell. And this alliance aims to drive transformational change on labour rights in the Malaysian glove industry. The idea here being that larger groups of like-minded companies working together to lift labour standards will mean change happens quicker. There are several key drivers of change and progress. These include the manufacturers, but they also include purchasers and end users. So customers, purchasers, end users should have consistent methods in place to ensure they're buying products free from forced labour, purchasing products from suppliers who are transparent as to what they're doing to combat modern slavery in the supply chain and honest about the challenges and the progress still to be made. If you are working with people that say everything's fine, there are no issues, we have no risks, then they're not looking and they're not doing the work properly, I think is the reality. So that's it's very sort of an example of how we're managing through this very complex issue, but I hope it's been helpful to give you some insights into how we can reduce modern slavery risks in our supply chain. That's it from me.
And that was really, really informative. I think next time I should have the whole group at our event for you to bring this to it, because the reason I sit on the board of the ECHO group is because to be fair to the government, they're trying to bring this to the forefront and let people understand what they could do to help them more. And with a company like yourself, Ansell, who's taking the lead and also setting up this group RGA, I think it's really, really important. I think the most important thing that I find is that we're focusing on the individual people, not just the companies. The way we help the companies is by explaining what the do's and don'ts are, and not try and hide push things under the carpet until it's too late. So the more we talk about this subject and make sure that companies realize that it's not, oh my God, I'm going to get in trouble. And this was us talking yesterday, but I know I'm going to be fine. They're very well aware of that, and the rules are not movable. I think the more we talk about it, the better. I think it will be and this comes down to education as well, so that they don't fall back into a minefield where they make the mistake and keep making the mistakes and not realizing there's a simple solution to try and rectify that. So thank you very much, Catherine, for that. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. We're bringing on our next speaker, which is Mandy Soar, Chief Executive Officer of Bendi. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvette, and yeah, thank you, Jennifer and Catherine. Really thought-provoking conversation so far. So I've definitely got some points on that. But yeah, just to introduce Bendi, we are a technology company helping brands both in the fashion apparel space, but also textiles and workwear. I think they're often overlooked, but incredibly well used part of the textile supply chain to really get that monitoring piece of understanding their supply chains. And we do this using big data. So I think a couple of things were mentioned that I'd like to touch on. I think one of them was around audit fatigue, really. And I think audits have been historically and continue to be primarily the way in which, as a brand, you have access to understanding what's happening at your suppliers. So we harness the power of technology to use. We live in a digital age. Our suppliers and the workers at those suppliers now all have mobile phones, have some sort of digital footprint. When incidents occur within the world, there's some sort of a footprint of that, whether it's a report in the local paper, whether it's something that's been issued to a local body, or perhaps a legal document. It might have been something in a social media board, some other kind of conversation that's taken place, but there's a kind of a digital palimpsest of it that exists in the world. So Bendi looks at 7 different types of information sources, all the way from kind of legal and national down to things that are, I guess, much more like social media type. So things that are kind of set in stone. We know that this is completely true. To actually, we've seen some sort of information about this, and we use this to build a picture about what's happening for the world of suppliers and workers. So when we work with companies, we take their suppliers and we sort of, if you think of Bendi as a kind of add water, but actually what you do is you add suppliers. And what we give you is an outcome of what's happened to those suppliers, what have been their historical experiences around human rights issues. And we do that for a number of years. We've built kind of patterns for some suppliers, that things that really haven't come up in audits, even though that supplier has been audited multiple times, because there are many challenges with the audit mechanism. Usually, when your auditor's coming, or an event might happen, the auditor might attend now, but in 3 months' time, event might occur, but it's not caught by the audit. And I think it's nobody's fault. It's just, this is the challenge of using an auditing mechanism. So really what we're providing is 24/7 risk monitoring, to give you a flavor of the kinds of information that we found. Everything from a sustained pattern of union busting and strikes over a decade in a supplier that has been audited multiple times, to really quite severe cases of things like a chemical spill that actually led to death of a worker, which didn't show up in an audit. Incidences such as violence, sexual violence, all the way to kind of the things like forced overtime and forced labor. We also look at the kind of those patterns that I think, Catherine, you were speaking about, in terms of, is this organization part of one of the on a banned list by the US or someone else? but we also look at it on a kind of vertical perspective. Is that company owned? Is this supplier part owned by an organization that is on the ban list? So sometimes we found that actually our client supplier, 50% of it is owned by, even though they're based in Vietnam, they're actually 50% owned by a Chinese company, which has been a known offender of forced labor. And so really what we do is help those organizations, help the senior executives of those organizations. And I'm talking about people who are, head of sustainability, general counsel, to have no surprises. Because I think that's the worst thing that can, of course, these are incredibly deep issues that we want to address, but as an executive of a company, from a business perspective, you don't want to see surprises. So we ensure that we minimize the likelihood of you seeing surprises in your supply chain. I think the other thing to touch upon is we're not just looking at those kind of immediate suppliers. So again, I think Jennifer, you talked about most of the focus historically has been on the assembly point, and maybe you looked at the line below. So if I think of this T-shirt, it was put together at a RMG factory, perhaps in Bangladesh, most likely, and then it was spun in a mill somewhere into the fabric. And some of the best brands, and I know Catherine, you have kind of these connections with those deeper parts of your supply chain. You'll know where those raw materials come from in some instances, but sometimes not, especially when we look at apparel, which is incredibly complicated. You've got linings, you've got buttons, you've got finishes, and all of these additional things, all going all the way down to the deeper parts of your supply chain. So covering all of that is impossible, actually, using an audit, because you don't have a financial relationship with the people, with the supplier who spun that material. But if you know who they are, or in fact, we can help you to identify who they are, also using data mechanisms through our trade models. We can tell you who your most likely mill was, and then we can also address that through our risk monitoring. And then you can really look at this and say, okay, where are the biggest risks? What are the most severe risks? How much of my product is going through this? And for every piece of risk, or as we call them, risk events that Bendi delivers to a client, we show you, severity. We show you, and we show you the likelihood, like the truth. How true is it? How sure are we of the information that we're giving you? If it's been if it's gone through court and there's a stamp from like a national body, then you can be very, very certain of this information. If it's something that's really been published in a local paper and the evidence is through some social media channel, then actually it's less likely, there's a bigger question mark on it. And if 20% of your product goes through it, well, then the materiality is really high and it's worth investigating. And so in this, on an annual perspective, I think companies used to have risk kind of, I think previously what were externalities, things that didn't really come into risk registers, have now become salient risks. And those salient risks cannot be monitored, especially with the incoming regulations, the human rights due diligence regulations, can't be monitored on an annual basis. They can't even be monitored on a semi-annual basis. They actually need much more regular attention. And so that's what our technology allows brands and companies to do, to kind of understand those risks as they emerge. And it's like, you might not do anything. The outcome might be no action, but at least there's no surprise. And that reputational damage that I think, Catherine, you spoke about, the kind of risk of your product being stopped at the US border, potentially really having high risks of fines in the future. I think those things can be massively avoided.
So is your data, let me jump in there, your data, because my head is just like, I'm working from both sides. So your data can start tracking right from the beginning all the way through. Is that what you're saying? You can follow the the whole supply chain all the way through data gathering and working.
In some instances, it depends. I think that's the first part of the work that we do. So you give us, so we work together on the suppliers that you know about, and then through trade models, we can find who they've traded with, and then where the previous component part of that would have come from. And in some cases, we've managed to go all the way back to sort of farm level or raw material level. In some cases, not. It really depends on the availability. In one instance, we were able to increase visibility 7-fold. So it very much depends. And then once, visibility, transparency is the bedrock of sustainability. It isn't sustainability itself. It's what you need in order to do good sustainability work. So once we've got that first piece figured out with you, that's when the monitoring comes in.
Yes. Good. Somebody mentioned to us about the other day, which it's keep poking me in my back, so I'm going to bring it to the table, about AI. Do you see that, Mandeep, as something that you will be sort of embracing yourself with what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a buzzword, I think, for a bit of time. I mean, we use machine learning models. That's effectively what that is. They will learn over time on how to identify risks better. We work in multiple different languages because the things that you need to know are not just happening in English speaking languages. You need, the machine needs to be able to understand Tamil and Hindi and Chinese and Vietnamese and Spanish. So there is a very much an AI element into what we do, and there is a learning aspect to the models that we've built and continue to build. But yeah, I'm sort of I think we're generally a bit wary of using buzzwords. We prefer to use kind of what it is. It's a machine that is harvesting information, filtering that in multiple languages so that we can identify risks. And that's, sometimes just use the simplest words to explain what it is rather than this kind of fancy buzzword.
Thank you so much. Before I hug you, because my brain is going crazy and I want to ask you all a few more questions, but I'm going to put this over to Declan to see if there's any questions we have at the moment that you want to put to the panel.
So Mandeep,
Thank you.
have you finished before I go into any questions?
Yes, of course. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So when it comes to obviously the information that's being relayed to the customer, whichever brand or retailer it might be or manufacturer, where do these data sources come from? Are they sourced from the wider web or different organizations and input by Bendi, or how does that work?
That's for me, right?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so as I think I briefly mentioned, we look at 7 different types of data sources. So some of them will be, it might be something that's published in a court of law, or it might be a grievance to a legal authority. And so our tools go searching for those in each country, in each language. And then similarly, if we're looking at press, we might look at the national press, so there are multiple newspapers. We might look at international press, and then also local press. There are industry bodies, those might be the UN, but they might also be very, very specific, like BRAC, for example. And so happy to kind of share some of that. It's also on our website, all the different data sources that we look at. And then for any risk that we do deliver, and we say, look, this is what we found for this supplier at this time, we tell you exactly where we found that information. We provide a link to it, even if it's not in a language that you can read or write. And we give it a rating on how sure we are that this is true.
And that's obviously really important. It's, I guess, there's a big issue at the moment with kind of outdated information, and Jennifer, that's going to bring me onto you now. So when it comes to the companies and due diligence and what they need to do to ensure compliance, is there a standardization around these kind of measurements or metrics, if you will, and how does a company know if they're working to the best set of requirements? So over to you.
So if you talk about the human rights due diligence, I think everyone is preparing right now to what this could look like, and action plans for countries are actually being looked into, that what should the due diligence requirements be for each country, because it's state and private sector that need to work together. So I'm optimistic that the measuring tools that will come out now for risk assessment and risk mitigation, if these are contextualized, which need to be contextualized, because there's the country's policies, culture, and various other things need to be taken into account. So the measuring tools can be set out. What Bendi talks about on the data, compiling the data, I think moving forward as we are more clear of what those certain indicators are going to be, what are the common issues coming up, what are the priority issues coming up, and then sort of, and how that is measured and monitored. So risk assessment will have to bring in the mitigation. The monitoring will come at a later stage with the assessment, the mitigation measures, and then the monitoring. And I think what all the people have said, transparency is very key, and supporting each other is very key to ensure this work, so that we can see the end goal, that rights and a conducive work environment is ensured. But in that process, we all need to support each other. One of the main cruxes is, if there are rights violations, that the reportings are very transparent and the address mechanism are used as best practices for other people also, for other organizations and corporations, so that there is an openness towards it. And that would actually achieve the end goal. So I think that is very important. And rather than fines and everything, which was brought up initially, I just thought about it now. Why not have risk ratings? Risk ratings, we can start with risk ratings to move towards the fines rather than penal measures. So low risk, medium risk, high risk ratings could support towards then coming on to the fines that come up because certain time has gone by. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So if we look at the UK, different countries in Europe and the EU itself, Catherine mentioned some the US's regulations as well. So regardless of what each country does within their rules, the commonality is around being able to show that you're trying to improve. And is that, would you say that's almost the bottom line? Is showing, regardless of where you are in the world, it's showing that you're taking steps to improve.
Yeah, and I mean, if I comment quickly, I think that's where we've seen a shift in this area. So several years ago, you wouldn't want to be transparent about issues you were finding because people didn't understand it, and they'd go, "Oh, there's a risk there, I'm walking away." Whereas now, transparency is really creating a dialogue, so you can be honest. I'm like, these are the challenges we have. This is what we're doing to improve it. Let us know if you have any suggestions on better ways to do it or things that have worked for you, and we improve it. But we've lifted that kind of veil and we can be honest now, and hopefully that will continue. I mean, even when, you know, I have conversations with investors, they're aware of the challenges and that nothing's perfect. So you can be much more open, and with that openness actually does help create that change. So I think it's a really important shift that we're seeing probably over the last 12 to 18 months.
Oh, so pleased you said that.
Yeah.
So pleased you said that, because that's exactly what I was alluding to earlier, you know, during our meeting. And I think the word transparency is like before here in the professional clothing industry. Everybody, oh no, we mustn't tell what our competitors, mustn't make them see what we're doing, or they mustn't know what customers we have. We live in an age whereby everything is on the net. So sort of trying to hide it is not the way forward. And that's what I was saying earlier about the companies and the individuals involved as well. We need to be able to educate them to make them know that they can come forward if they see there's a problem, rather than trying to hide it and run with it. What you're doing, Mandeep, is so important. The technology you've got there is blowing my mind, and I can just hear my colleagues at the Home Office talking about all of this and what can they do better and how can they help companies. And several of my colleagues put forward questions yesterday that if they were sitting and listening to this, they'd be like, oh my God, this is exactly what I want to hear. You know, so I will be sending them this video to say, look, these are 3 amazing people that you guys need to be speaking with as well, because it's all impacting. And just like you said earlier, everything changes so quickly every quarter, every month, every week. Everything changes so quickly. You know, we could have one meeting this quarter and we go back and something else is totally different to what we discussed. And we think we're working on to solve that problem, but it's already been passed and gone and something else has come along. So if we can have something to help to drive and mitigate all the stress and education behind all this, and this is where I think all of you come in. I think that is an amazing opportunity for the whole industry. There's a question flashing there, Declan.
Yeah, so I'm aware of the time, but I think this is a good question. It's been directed at Catherine, but maybe one of you or Jennifer will be good for this. So so the question is around capacity building, essentially. So if you're, Catherine, you were talking about this earlier, you intend to make sure that you help to engage and improve a supplier before walking away, because otherwise it doesn't solve the problem, it just shifts it onto someone else. Now, what processes or mechanisms or organizations are there if that person didn't improve or refused to improve? So you were to walk away, that wouldn't do anything, but is there anyone or any entity out there that you can go to escalate, if you will?
Not really. I mean, we do our best to try and really engage with that supplier first, to try and educate, to try and help them understand where their risks lie, why they should fix it and mitigate these risks, and the actions that they need to sort of do to bring their standards up to par. You know, I'm not aware of any sort of reporting agencies where you kind of dob on a supplier. But I think, again, this is where that collaboration, I mean, if you have industries where suppliers, customers, end users are focused on this, eventually these customers won't be able to, they won't have the business to support them. And I think that's not where we want to get to, because at the end of the day, if those businesses aren't operating, then workers don't have jobs. So our primary focus is to get suppliers on board with this program and to get everyone focusing on worker conditions, decent work, fair labour practices, so that you see the shift across the board. There's always going to be black sheeps that take longer, that don't get there, and they'll have to be weeded out in time, and hopefully those workers can still maybe find other employment. But at the moment, we don't sort of have a reporting mechanism. It's working with them until the point that we really can't anymore. Because, I mean, there's also, you know, action that could be taken against us as a purchaser of their products if we know that there's severe risks. I mean, we have to be careful in our engagement as well. So it's a fine line, but definitely we really do put a lot of time into engagement, training if we can, capacity building, and supporting them in their journey to improve labour standards.
That's great.
And actually, just on that point, I think that's why I originally reached out to Jennifer and BRAC, because we thought, you know, at Bendi, we identify those risks, but that's really only the beginning. Once you actually know something that's happened and you want to take an action, what's the next step? And yeah, organizations like BRAC and the work that Jennifer does, I think that's the kind of collaboration, engagement, worker improvement, addressing those things over a long time. It's not a quick fix. Yeah.
No.
And I'd like to just add on that is that many companies are ahead of the curve, but to do the risk assessment and risk mitigation is rather new. What we are talking about on risks and then following up the monitoring evaluation, we always looked at it from a compliance perspective, audit perspective. You don't have this needs to be done. Now we're saying that through a management process, you assess your risk, you bring in what are your challenges, and then what are the mitigation measures to basically minimize your risk. This approach is new. And this is the shift from, I think, from compliance is happening, that factories are not being told what, but now we have to educate factories, not only why you need to do it, what you need to do, how you need to do. That will help them own it. So capacity building is very much important. And I think that relationship is very important with the brands also. So that now we move towards factories and the supply chain owning their risks, mitigating their risks, and looking at the future direction that it actually supports in their productivity and supports in having a good workforce where they're happy to work. So many organizations I think developmental organizations can support now in bringing that capacity building efforts for the private sector, because this blending will actually help in system strengthening for the private sector, where many people, especially in third world countries and other countries, it's where you can actually make systemic changes for improvement. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, I think there's been a lot of information about what's changing in the industry in terms of regulations, what impact it can have on businesses, and some potential solutions out there to help overcome those challenges and risks. So I think it's time to say thank you to all of our speakers today, Catherine, Mandeep, and Jennifer, and obviously Yvette as well. So thank you very much for tuning in to everyone today. We really appreciate it, and we hope this conversation continues. If anyone would like to ask any questions after the webinar, please get in touch with PCW and we can direct you to the relevant speakers. And this webinar will also be added onto our website if you want to rewatch or if you missed part of it. So thank you everyone from PCRW and from everyone on the panel today. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Speak soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.